All right. So I've already introduced the climate challenge here in Rhode Island, getting to 45% emissions reductions by 2030, net zero by 2050. One thing I'll mention is that in a lot of ways, the 2050 goal is more intimidating because net zero is a long ways away. But I think that the 2030 goal is just as hard. And that's because we have done very little. We're almost a third of the way, quarter of the way through the decade, and we have so long to go to get to that 2030 goal, especially if we continue to stave off action as much as we have been. But 100% by renewable electricity by 2030 is so exciting in part because we can lock in emissions reductions. It's something that we can do now and feel much more confident that we'll be able to meet that 45% emissions reductions goal by 2030. It is not going to be possible to reduce our transportation emissions 45% by 2030. That would mean replacing many cars that were just bought and have already been on the road, especially some vehicles that people might not have good electric options for yet. However, we absolutely can get to 100% renewable electricity by 2030. And so that's where the majority of our emissions reductions for that 2030 goal have to come from. The piece of legislation that was introduced, it's in its second year being introduced in this form. The original version was kind of kicked off in part by Governor Raimondo's 2020 executive order, pushing for 100% renewable by 2030. The current version, the leadership has really been taken on by Senate President Dominic Ruggiero and House Environment, I think it's the House Telecom Utility Chair, Deborah Giro. The bill requires that electric suppliers in the state, by far the biggest of which is National Grid, must buy an increasing percentage of the electricity that they supply customers with from renewable electricity. That mostly means solar and wind, but I think there are some other eligible renewable sources, including hydro, small-scale sustainable hydro, and anaerobic digestion, which is a very cool way of making electricity out of animal waste products. This bill would make sure that that increasing percentage of electricity reaches 100% in 2030. We've had a renewable energy standard since 2004. Rhode Island was one of the first states in the country to have a renewable energy standard, and it has helped us get from 0% renewable electricity in our mix to 20% today over the last 18 years or so. But again, we of course have a long way to go. We also have way more renewable energy than we did back in 2004, or even the last time this bill was updated, which I believe was in 2015 or so. So we need to just up this renewable energy standards ambition just to stay with the times, the amount of renewable energy resources that we have available to us. So I want to talk briefly about the actual functional mechanism of the renewable energy standard, and that is renewable energy certificates. We are on one shared electric grid here in New England. That means that we just don't know, because of the physics of electrons, when we turn on our lights here in Rhode Island, we don't know whether the electrons are coming from our neighbor's solar panels, which may be produced more than their house is using, so fed back onto the grid, or it could be coming from a wind turbine in Maine, or it could be coming from the natural gas plant here in Providence. We just don't know, we can't track electrons that way. But we also want to be able to take credit for buying and using renewable energy, and we want to know what type of electricity we're using in Rhode Island or even in our individual household. And that is where renewable energy certificates come in. This is a really, really smart mechanism to create a transparent and accountable tracking system for renewable energy. Here's how it works. We have electrons on our grid here. They're floating around. We have a renewable energy generator. When a renewable energy generator, in this case a wind turbine, spins and produces 1 megawatt hour of electricity, there's that 1 megawatt hour of electricity flowing onto the grid. It also produces a renewable energy certificate. A renewable energy certificate, or REC, I'm just going to call it REC from here on out, is a virtual tracker of renewable energy. All of the RECs that are produced, so all of the renewable energy that is produced in New England, is tracked and stored in a database at ISO New England, which is the regional grid operator. They make sure that we always have enough supply to meet demand. When someone uses renewable electricity, when they buy renewable electricity and want to get credit for using that renewable electricity, they get their megawatt hour off of the grid, the megawatt hour of electrons, their house lights up. They also purchase and retire a renewable energy certificate to represent that they used that amount of electricity worth of renewable energy and not some other type of energy. This is how the renewable energy standard works. This is how we're able to track renewable energy when it would be so difficult if we were just relying on, the electrons that are on the grid. It's also how our Green Powered program works for any of you who might be Green Powered members, because we provide you with green electricity by retiring renewable energy certificates on your behalf. RECs are great. I think some people think of RECs as like funny money, an accounting trick, not real renewable energy. No, RECs are the only way we have to transparently account for renewable energy and make sure that we're not double counting. And make sure that the people who are buying and paying for renewable energy get credit for using it. They also, I do want to mention, I'm not going to go into this too much, they also create a funding stream for renewable energy developers that helps get renewable energy off the ground. So they make it possible for more renewable energy to be created in the state. They also interrelate with other policies that we have, like the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, to lower the cap for carbon emissions from electric generators and make sure that fossil fuel plants are being retired sooner. So RECs interplay with all of our different policy because it's the accounting, it's our tracking system for how much renewable energy we have in New England. It plays with all of these other policies to make sure that we're reducing emissions steadily from our fossil fuel, from our electric system, that we're getting rid of fossil fuel generation. So backing up. The Renewable Energy Standard, this policy, what it does is it requires the electric suppliers to buy renewable energy certificates matching with an increasing percentage of the electric load. This graphic I find is one of the most useful ones we have. This top black line, I'm going to start drawing on this. This top black line we have here, this is how much electricity we're going to be using over time. It's a prediction. We're here in 2022. We'll just circle that. So we currently use every year in Rhode Island about 7,500 gigawatt hours. It's going to stay about the same all the way through 2030 with current predictions. This does include some amount of electrification towards the end of the decade. This dotted black line here, this is our current renewable energy standard. The current renewable energy standard has us reaching just about 30%, 35% of our electricity from renewable sources by 2030. This orange line is kind of the path we will need to be on, what this piece of legislation will put us on. I actually will draw a different line because the latest version of the bill has a different path. So our path to 100% will look a little bit more like this, curving upwards towards the end of the decade under the current legislation. How do we meet this goal? As you can see, it's a lot higher than our current needs for renewable electricity. The key is offshore wind. On this slide, you see that Revolution Wind, that's our current contracted project. It's 400 megawatts of offshore wind. That's by far the biggest project in Rhode Island. We currently have Deepwater Wind. Deepwater Wind was the first offshore wind project in the United States. It is 25 megawatts. So we're going from 25 megawatts of offshore wind in Rhode Island to 400 megawatts of offshore wind in Rhode Island. When that project is built, which we're expecting for 2024 or 2025, we are actually going to have a lot of surplus renewable energy certificates. We're going to be exporting renewable energy out of state because if you add together all of those RECs, that renewable energy from Revolution Wind, plus our existing solar, which is represented by these bars towards the bottom, we have more renewable energy than we know what to do with. We're going to be shipping it out of state. And that is part of why it's so important that we up our renewable energy standard, because we don't want other states to get credit for the renewable energy that we're building here. We want to get credit for this renewable energy that we're building. Once you go out to 2026, 2027, we are going to need another big renewable energy procurement, because that 400 megawatts of Revolution Wind gets us a big chunk of the way towards our goal, but not even close to all the way. There is a piece of legislation currently introduced by Senator Don Oyer and Rep. Art Handy that we strongly support, that would make sure that we have 600 megawatts more of wind, hopefully more than that, procured to help us get to this goal. That's represented by this green bar. And I'll also acknowledge that this still doesn't get us all the way, but we believe that this small gap, the gap that we have to 100%, I'm highlighting that in green right now, this gap can be made up for by improvements to our solar programs, another offshore wind project, imports from other states. Once we get that big 600 megawatt of offshore wind, once we have Revolution Wind built, that's already contracted, it's most of the way through the permitting process, we are so close to meeting our goal. We absolutely can do it by adopting more good solar and wind policies in the next 8 years. So that was all my messy drawings, and we'll go on to the next slide. I've kind of talked about this already. How will electric suppliers meet this new renewable energy standard? They can do that by using up the surplus that we're expecting. They can enter long-term contracts with offshore wind. In fact, this is especially important because the number one way to keep costs down for renewable energy is to keep these contracts low, so that we have affordable, cheap renewable energy coming into the state. And as I mentioned, we're going to need other policies to fill the gap towards the end of the decade, like solar programs, energy efficiency. We especially want to see solar on rooftops and developed lands, and we're currently supporting legislation that would expand solar programs in developed areas. So we've got some talking points, kind of recapping what I said. I won't go too much into this, but we all know that the price of electricity is going up because the price of fossil fuels is going up globally. Political events, pandemic, so many things, factors in that. Clean electricity that is local, reliable, and affordable, and produces economic benefits here in Rhode Island, that is the future. That's what we need to transition to. There's only 3, maybe 4 weeks left in this legislative session. We need you to call your legislators today as soon as possible to ask them to support these bills. It's really important that we pass both 100% by 2030 and the 600 megawatts of offshore wind, the 600 megawatts of offshore wind legislation, because together those will help us get to this goal, help us to get to that 2030 climate goal. Our blog, Green Energy Consumers, I'm actually going to copy a link directly to a specific blog that has information on how you can contact your legislators. I'll copy that into the chat when I'm done, and we can, hopefully you can find what you need there, reach out to your legislators, and also if you have any other questions about Rhode Island policy, we have a lot more information on our blog. That's a great way to get updated on what we're doing when it comes to policy advocacy. And with that, I will wrap up. So curious to hear, Meg and Beth, if you have anything to add to that discussion, or those of you who are not familiar with the Renewable Energy Standard, please ask questions. Meanwhile, I'll copy our blog into the chat.
I have nothing to add. I just have a question. When you were drawing on the map or on the graph, why is the blue line why did the slope change so much? So it seems easier to achieve near-term goals, but then it jumps at the end, like the hockey stick approach generally doesn't work. So I'm just wondering what changed in the legislation.
That's a good question. Why is it done that way? I think because legislators were concerned about jumping up so much in the near term. I think if I were designing this policy all by myself, I would have it map onto our predictions for where the market will be at. So I would have it jump up a lot in the next couple of years because of that predicted rec surplus, and then maybe taper off a little bit while we expect the next offshore wind project to be built, and then jump up again. But we also can't rely on timelines for offshore wind happening as we expect. Anything can happen. And the good news is that it is a competitive market where it should kind of self-regulate over time.
Yeah, I just get worried with that jump at the end that we're just deferring. We're just hoping that we'll figure it out later. And that tends to not work.
I completely agree. I think one thing I'll say is it's not too much of a jump up. The current bill has us going up 4% next year, 5% the following year, 6% the year after that. And then I think it's about between 7 and 8% for the rest of the time to get to 2030.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, Kai. You mentioned that the emissions targets are binding and mandatory. What happens if the targets are not met?
Well, then hopefully we know someone, maybe our colleagues at Conservation Law Foundation, which Meg is the Rhode Island director, or I guess no longer Rhode Island, you were interim director. What's your title now, Meg?
Your attorney.
Amazing. So Meg and her colleagues at Conservation Law Foundation will be able to sue the state. Anyone can sue the state for not being on track or not meeting those goals. In fact, in Massachusetts, back in 2014, Green Energy Consumers and Conservation Law Foundation worked together to sue Massachusetts because they were not on track to their binding goals. And that court order has been really important, both in keeping Massachusetts meeting its climate targets and in adopting new policy to meet its climate targets, but also in giving us a model in Rhode Island and throughout the country for how we can have binding climate targets that work.
Thank you.
I have a question. I have a question about the offshore wind. It seems like it takes an awful long time to go through the regulatory process and all the interests like fishermen and even some landowners. So is there? Yeah, and you're depending on so much of the offshore wind to meet the the needs. So how do we get over that hurdle?
Great question. It is, I mean, I will agree, like it is kind of concerning to imagine relying so much on one resource to meet this goal. The 100% by 2030 study by Brattle that was done for the Office of Energy Resources back in 2020 outlined different scenarios of meeting the goal with offshore wind, without offshore wind, focusing on solar, other resources. The scenarios that included a mix but focus on offshore wind were the cheapest to ratepayers and seem the best path forward. It's not the only way we could do it, but again, it's the cheapest to ratepayers, the most reliable. There are things that we can do now to make sure that everyone's on the same page with offshore wind and to speed the permitting process. And one of the things that we want to see from the next offshore wind procurement is a couple of months where the public and all of the stakeholders can weigh in on the draft RFP before it goes out to bid for renewable energy developers, so that we have some time to reflect on what we all want to see from this contract and make sure that it's a good RFP. But it does take a lot of time, and if things go wrong, then we kind of are regionally in trouble. So hopefully things go well.
Okay, it seems like the public needs a lot of PR. I mean, all the people on this site are all for it. They're passionate, but we need to get the people who are not so passionate involved.
Well, also, thank you for reminding me to plug. We have an offshore wind webinar coming up next week that is directed at the public. We're always trying to do more op-eds and letters to the editor talking about why this is such a good resource. And so we do have a couple of events and initiatives to do some of that public outreach, but it's always hard to get beyond those who already are passionate about it.
Okay, just wanted to make those few comments. Thank you.
Excellent. All right. Bye, everyone. See you in the big room.